Good morning. So we're going to talk about maps and mapping today. And but before we do that, I want to go back to some of the points that I made yesterday, both as a refresher and also based on some of the questions that were raised. So one of the questions that came up from one of you is that how do you really understand scale in a map? So there are many ways of indicating scale in a map. So one is you have basically something like this that says 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That means if you, whatever this number is, this distance is, if you map it here, that's exactly that distance. Okay. However, if you have a map which says 1 inch equal to 10 feet, if you make it smaller or larger, it does not scale. Okay. If you have a scale like this, it scales. Okay, you can scale it up and down. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And a couple of things are very important in a map. Sometimes you will find them missing, but they really should be there. The other is a north line. Okay, so that you can orient yourself in the map. Okay. In terms of understanding, because we discussed city plans already, are there any particular questions you have about city plans that you don't understand how to read them? You understand how you can read plans, city maps? No? No, but you don't. So which part don't you understand?
Especially if there are different levels of elevation in the city, that development reflected.
So what happens is that, Calcutta actually happens to be extremely flat terrain, so there's not worth noting the level unless you are doing a drainage plan, which these maps are not intended to do. When I showed the map of Miletus, Turkey, the Greek colonial city, you'll notice there are contour lines. And when contour lines, mean these dotted lines, are closer, that means it's steeper. And typically, if it's a very well done map, you'll actually have the levels indicated, so you can understand what the slope is like. Okay, does it make sense? So if there are no indications of slopes, you either need other information, other documents to infer whether there are slopes. There's a topographical distance in terms of gradient. Or otherwise, you presume there is none. In case of Calcutta, there's no significant difference between, let's say, the riverside and the lakeside. It actually does drain that way towards the lake, but that doesn't show up in a map of this scale. Okay? It's not worth representing in contour lines. This is one of the important things about scale, is that for a detailed map, a lot of things will show up. A map at this scale, a city plan that is, it won't show up. Okay? And in terms of, we're going to look at some river surveys today, where you can, different kinds of maps, so you can think about how they're different from these kinds of sort of very rudimentary city plans. Okay, and yeah.
We have talked about the visual representation part of the map and all that, but regarding the labeling part, let's say the toponyms, the names of places, sites, and all that. So I believe that what places are they may be represented, but they may be not named. Other places may be named, they are labeled. So is there any sort of, let's say, ideology or some sort of?
We're going to talk about that. Maps are deeply etymological. Okay, they include some information by necessity and exclude some information by necessity. Imagine how much information is deleted from this, is not included, because this map is actually drawn, and we've taken it from a book, which is merely trying to show the major interventions across 300 years. So it's not a planner's map. It's just a representation of some of the key built events. Okay? So they may not have all kinds of information. And one of the things that I perhaps didn't mention yesterday when we talked about the white town, black town, it was very typical in early 18th century maps and even early 19th century maps of Calcutta, just shade the area of so-called the northern part of the city, the so-called black town, and not indicate any details because it was not considered deemed sufficiently important. Okay? And those are fairly typical in maps actually. Okay? Maps are deeply ideological. You can represent some things, you can exclude others, precisely because nothing is one-to-one representation. So you have to make selections. Okay? The politics is in what selections you make. But in I had invoked this in the context of who has, in terms of the power dynamics at the city level. And then we talked a little about power dynamics at the building level. What just happened? So when I showed this map yesterday, and this is a very detailed plan, and this is actually done in the 1880s as a kind of a draft of a far more sort of elaborate plan of mapping all of Calcutta at a very detailed scale. Here you have a lot more details. You have indications of the width of sidewalks, width of streets. You actually have every lamppost. I mean, it's an incredibly detailed map. When we were talking about, how is imperial power exercised and how do you understand the relative workings of power, I didn't discuss the map, the plan itself. This is part of what would now be called the Central Business District. This is part of the central area of Calcutta, very much at the heart of colonial Calcutta. So this is Dalhousie Square. This part is where the government houses. Okay, and note how this is the post office, and these are the opium go-downs and customs go-downs, and then there are tea go-downs. They're very large opium go-downs. I mean, massive ones, right next in the heart of the colonial city, and of course. This is, the river here. So very close to the river, very close to the railways. So you have to think about the positioning of these warehouses. And they were often called go-downs. That's a term that you are used to. It's actually a very Anglo-colonial term, and that has also gone to parts of East Asia. It is not actually used in much of the rest of the world. But the idea of massive opium go-downs comes from, of course, the needs of imperial trade. And here I want you to think about how we analyze space in cities. So what I showed you last day is that I can look at the city in itself and think of the power dynamics between let's say the Indian elite and the British elite. That's one thing you can do. These are the property owning people. These are people who are making decisions. You can look at the urban grain, the grain of the urban fabric, and understand something about how negotiations are done, spatial negotiations are done, or simply what is where, where are things, where are shops. So the plans that I just showed you, they have incredible details. When you pair them with street directory, you know exactly what commercial interventions were there in the 19th century city. But you can also take the idea that, particularly the idea of such large opium go-downs in the central part of the city, very visible, that you can also think about connecting Calcutta to cities such as Canton, which they were connected to by trade. So what kind of spatial analysis would emerge if you did that? In other words, if you did not confine yourself to the city of Calcutta per se, the jurisdictional part, you'll get a different, you'll have to be asking a different set of questions, basically. So here I want us to think about why those opium go-downs in Calcutta at that scale. The history is pretty much known, but what intrigues me are the spatial sort of articulations of that. So this is the situation in the 18th century. Britain, like European powers, is draining bullion into China because of the demand for tea. Tea had become a fashionable beverage, and then it's spreading to not just the elite, but middle classes. There's great demand for tea. And there's also demand for, of course, Chinese silk and porcelain. And this is not, those two are not new. These are ancient, prized imports from China. The problem here is that, there are not enough Western commodities that China wants, except a few luxury goods, nor does India, none of these Asian countries need that. What we have is a imbalance of trade. Now, the balance of trade is firmly in the hands, in this case of, let's say, we're going to talk about opium, in the hands of China, the favorable balance of trade. Now, under mercantilism, which was the sort of the presiding philosophy of trade and commerce and finance, the idea is that you want most of those, let's say, crassly speaking, most of the wealth in your coffers. Okay. So the idea is that you want most bullion in your coffers and not in somebody else's. You don't want to drain bullion. Okay? So you want somehow to change this imbalance, trade imbalance. So in the 18th century, what the East India Company was doing is, since the Qing Emperor and the Qing Empire had prohibited the importation of opium to China, in the mid 18th century it was allowed in small amounts, and then they really got strict about it. That they were doing it through proxies. In other words, they were, let's call it what it was, they were smuggling opium into China. Okay? So the story is very well known. The point is that in the early 19th century, the 13 factories in Guangzhou, this is Canton, they all have their individual national flags. So the major European powers are represented in this sort of the game. And this has a direct relation to what is happening in London. In other words, depending on your analysis, you can actually think about, I'm going to look at London and the economic heart of London. I'm going to look at the economic heart of Calcutta, and then look at the economic heart of what's happening, whether it's Canton or Shanghai or whatever it is. In other words, there are deep connections that are often not discussed in spatial terms. So one evidence of so much material, whether it's goods, like luxury goods, of course commodities like tea and silk are moving, is that you have an entire sort of industry, and this is directed towards the import trade, in China producing objects like a punch bowl that depicts the factories in Canton. And this one doesn't look like much in Calcutta, but that's actually representing the Calcutta's waterfront in 1790, based on actually a 1750s drawing, which is actually thoroughly inaccurate. But I don't need to go in there. The point is that the Calcutta waterfront is represented in porcelain. Okay? So there's a demand for these commodities because they are important locations. They are collectibles. So it is useful to think about what happens when not just the raw commodities move from one part to another, in other words, the very big, bulk, profitable commodities, and we can think of, opium, tea, indigo, and so many, cotton and so many others, is that, what moves with them are ideas about art, ideas about planning, ideas about architecture as well. In other words, their ideas and knowledge and skills move across vast expanses. So what happens in the 19th century is Britain was certainly able to reverse the balance of trade. And it was done by war. And a key aspect of that was the ability to grow opium in northeastern India, and then having Calcutta as the port from which the opium fleet sailed. So these are actually very important nodes in the anti-opium trade. So, and this is all, none of this is, this is all illegal. If you look at the very helpful graph that the UN Office of Drugs and Crime provides, is that, up to here, Britain was not an important player. It was actually the Portuguese and the Dutch who controlled that trade. But then, 1775 onwards, it skyrockets. So tell me what's happening here politically. I mean, what enabled Britain to just control this trade? Yeah, well, exactly. In other words, control of Bengal and then the Bengal presidency. And this is also not just the Battle of Plassey, it's the Divania of Bengal, which allowed revenue collection, because you're controlling land and revenue. You can control a lot of aspects of agricultural production and commodity exchange. So it's a different ball game in the 18th century. And it is from that time that we usually think of Britain's emergence as an imperial power, long before it is actually, has significant territorial control. I mean, even in the 18th century, territorial control is very scattered. There's a bit in the south, bit in the east. It wasn't consolidated. So this is important because here you can mark the two opium wars, which allowed a different nature of trade. In other words, opium was forcibly introduced into China, quote unquote legally, and it created a very different urban landscape. Remember, I mentioned cities come in flux. So treaty ports were established. The first opium war, these are the treaty ports from the first opium war, and the second opium war created these. These are existing cities or towns which had attained a different identity as treaty ports. That means these towns would have significant foreign presence. And significant foreign presence means that you will also have significant architectural urban development based on those expectations. What that meant that the architecture and the spaces of these, they were called factories, because they were still called the factory system. This was the earlier factory system, where each country, rather the company based on, whether it's a Dutch East Indies Company, English East Indies Company, they all have their separate, what looks like townhouses with a very open yard, like a square. Okay? And there's the Pearl River. What happened is that, they had basically storage spaces, factory, warehouse, the way factories were organized. After that, it changed entirely. That system was gone. They were no longer sort of, huddled into one narrow space or one confined space. Now they occupied significantly more space. What that also meant that American, English, French, they had their own towns, let's say. This created a new landscape, urban landscape. This happens to be in Shanghai. They're called foreign concessions. Just want to give you a sense of what that looks like. This is one image from the Bund in Shanghai with the premises of Russell and Company, which is an American U.S. company, right? And what you see in terms of architecture is what you might find in Calcutta, actually. Okay, so both building types, building technology, ideas about how to organize space are moving from, East Asia to, East India to East Asia. And the idea, that's one of the reasons the term go down is used there, is because both the idea and the spatial type is being imported to that city. So this kind of premises, which you might find in Calcutta, became de rigueur in all of these towns. Particularly in Shanghai, it took a very concentrated urban form, and that's the Bund. And you know what Bund means, because it's Bund means it's embankment. It's a Hindi term. Okay, that's where it comes from. And early buildings of the Russell and Company looked like this, very much the Calcutta model. And then only in 1900 they would be refurbished with even more overt, what I would say, Western architectural aesthetics. So there is a transformation of how these spaces become sort of, really entrenched spaces of foreign capital. Architecture is very useful to look at if you want to understand investment of foreign capital. Who is investing, why they're investing, and how that is reshaping an urban landscape. My interest in opium, I don't work on opium trade. I have a very good colleague in Santa Barbara, Chattopadhyay, who shares my last name with an extra A. He does, historical work. He's a historian, does very good work on opium, ganja, basically. And he, looks at its production, and the impact. Actually, though he's not an architecture urban historian, he does look at the spatial impact, particularly what is now Bangladesh. And he's looking at, pre-independence, big work. What made me interested in, let's give it a term, intoxicants, is that I found going through, I've been working on on British colonialism for a long time. I've been looking at these archives for a long time. And I encountered so many lists of, like alcohol, inventories of alcohol. Whether they are in advertisements, whether this is Robert Clive's liquor inventory, and there are literally hundreds of them. And there's literally no work on them, and I couldn't figure out why. The ostensible reason could be, if you think about the volume of trade, it's small. It's nothing compared to, let's say, India workout, right? But that doesn't mean its significance is any less. So I got very interested in what kinds of liquor is being imported from Europe or the US, or the Americas, and what are the ports they're coming through. It should not be a surprise that Calcutta was the biggest port. But then how they're moving, how they're moving across, let's say, in this case, the very large Bengal presidency at that time, right? It's moving north, it's moving into what is, Punjab and other parts of the country. Like, how is that happening? Like, who are the actors? Where are they stored? And liquor cannot be stored under any condition, okay, because it'll go bad very fast. It needs to be stored it cannot be stored under very hot weather and things like that. So there are actually conditions that need to be met. So I became very interested in this. And the question was, can I map these connections? And that led me to all kinds of sort of by-lanes of research. One of the things I recognized is that if I think about the malt liquor, these different kinds of liquor, clearly Calcutta was the biggest port. But if I'm looking at all kinds of commodities, and I'm looking at East India Company's inventories, and what are being, all the things that are being imported, in total, beer, ale, spirits, whether British or foreign or wines, it's actually a small percentage. And this is my argument, it actually has a big impact. So does imported, what we called, here it would be called tinned, American term canned food. And it starts off in the early 19th century, really becomes big in the late 19th century. Because in the early 19th century, canning methods were very imperfect. So from the mid-19th century, it became important, but before that, there were bottled foods, pickles, jams, etc., all kinds of condiments. And these are what I call small sort of groups of artifacts, imported artifacts. But I'm interested in their impact, because what happens is that there's also a very large market in domestic liquor. And how did that, I wanted to understand how is that kind of pairing with imported liquor. And what happened because of this, because I don't know whether you know this, that liquor arrived in barrels, in sort of a large sort of containers, and they were bottled at port. That means cities like Calcutta had, and Bombay in particular, had big, trade in bottles and corks. And cork is the pit of a tree, so it's not something that grows everywhere. So it actually has to be imported. So bottles and bottling became a big commercial enterprise. And some families, like the Shield family, Motilal Shield's family, became millionaires doing that. And then that had a huge impact on what men like him did in terms of what I call the charitable landscape of Calcutta. Because then they diversified into other businesses. They became huge landlords. He owned something like 60 landed properties in Calcutta. Okay? And then made a tremendous impact on the charitable landscape. So in other words, one thing leads to another. There is a kind of impact that is slow, and you have to track them over the years, but they're profound. And you can trace it back to, well, liquor. And this is the part that I'm not going to go into. I like that, what we don't understand often register, because it's very removed from our sensibility. Even in the late 19th, early 20th century, you would not carry oil in bottles. You would carry them in, earthenware. The idea of introducing bottles into ordinary homes comes from the liquor landscape. Because you have to have bottles available which are being reused for other purposes before it becomes, dedicated to things like oil. Okay? Now, liquor, as you may imagine, produced a great deal of anxiety at all levels, because very few artifacts, objects of consumption are more racialized than liquor. It's classed and it's racialized. So I found this lovely little, caricature. It's a map, and the person who drew this, James Brown, called it the hydrography of Calcutta. I love that. What it shows is how, so the directions, sailing directions from Choringby to Bangshaw. And this is basically what sailors do, take the route to the grog shops in the center of the city. And it actually maps every little, and it's all in sort of marine language. So it's it's humorous, but it's also surprisingly accurate in terms of its actual map, like what's next to what. What you see here is that, there is, it's very close proximity to the police station, and this is Lal Bazaar. There's very close to the brothels in that area. And this is, in other words, talk of heterogeneous mix of European sailors, soldiers, crewmen, native laborers, and everybody you can think of who populate the bazaars of Calcutta. Okay? So this is the kind of heady mix that produced great anxiety among colonial authorities. And as a result, over and over again, I didn't give dates for these because they were tried many times, to prevent particularly liquor shops, and this is both foreign and domestic liquor shops, within it's like a clear 1 mile zones from these locations, Chandnagar, Chinsura, and Serampur. Real concern over the disorderly behavior of the working class, European working class, mind you. They really don't care much about the Indian working class here, because they probably cannot control it. But here they feel they can control the European working class. And irrespective of the prodigious amount of liquor that was consumed in elite European homes. I mean, the inventories are awesome. The amount of liquor that was consumed is formidable. And the effort to prevent soldiers from buying alcohol from the bazaars because they would make unholy connections meant that the system of supplying soldiers with liquor in cantonments, as ration, became normalized. This was practiced before, but it became really normalized. Now, I wanted to really understand how liquor is moving. So what I started doing and this is, I have typed my, little notes here and there. Trained as an architect, I always carry a little, notebook. I sketch and draw. And I realized that pretty much there's so many, and this doesn't even exhaust it by far that there are the upcountry small town distilleries and village and household stills, which, as you'll see in the next slide, is described as absolutely innumerable. In other words, there is no census of them. It's very difficult to get a census. Okay, they did try, and then I was encountering, like all of these places, and then this term, bottle khana. I had no idea what this was because I'm not familiar with this kind of room space. Well, it says what it is: a space for keeping bottles. But why would you have a dedicated space for keeping bottles? Because you have prodigious amounts of liquor. And then, you can think of vinegars, ketchups, etc. And ketchup, don't think of ketchup or what we think of ketchup as tomato ketchup. Ketchup can be any, fruit or vegetable mushed up like that with vinegar. And I didn't know what this, so they appear in all kinds of places. So I was trying to understand the relation between what I can relate upcountry small town distilleries with the river ghats and ocean-going trade. So I'm literally saying, what are all the spaces I can think about? Well, I recognized why the colonial authorities found it so difficult to map. Because to get concrete data is very difficult. You need data points, as we would say, to actually locate. Then you have to locate them. And if you have, and I'll show you today in the afternoon, when there are too many points in one small scale map, they're indistinguishable. So how do you distinguish them? You show block. In other words, when the spatial cluster is so dense, you reach the limits of representation in some ways. Okay, so as a process of maps and map making, you have to think about what that entails. I also, and just to give a sense of, once you notice something, it crops up everywhere. Okay, and then I noticed that in real estate ads, and these are examples of real estate ads, they're all part of service spaces. But I also discovered what I call the keepers of liquor. Since the government house kept a roster of the servants, you actually know that Robert Moore, there was a small coterie of European servants. He was the butler, but the wine Godan Sarkar was Bhavani Bose. Don't know much about Bhavani Bose. I still have not been able to find. These are very senior servants. Okay, and then there's Bottle Khana Sarkar is Qudratwallah, and then Soifullah. These people needed to know an enormous amount about foreign liquor to serve the table at Government House. So there's expertise, skill being acquired because they are in charge of all of this. So you have to think about what this means. And then, of course, it went down to the head of the table servant. And this produces a different vision of what is for me, and this is very important for me, I look at service spaces. What is the relation between not only servants and masters, but what are the service spaces like? These are what I categorically call small spaces. Bottle khanas typically are about 8 by 10 feet, dimensionally small. Unlike the warehouses and opium godowns, which can be massive, they are actually small. But they're marginal in the sense that there is certainly no history of them. Nobody has written about them. They're considered unimportant. What I found in my own research that they were terribly important. These were the elements that held up the colonial infrastructure at all levels. So one of the things I started looking at is, because I study plans, whether they are done by amateurs or by professional. This is a plan drawn by an amateur, and this is plan of Mini Woods bungalow in Jhelum, actually in the Punjab in 1858. This is useful to know. This is actually done by a good-for-nothing husband of hers, Arthur Woods, who submitted this plan to claim compensation because his house was trashed by his own servants during the Sepoy Rebellion. Okay, so he wanted compensation. So that's why we get this plan. But here it is, I have analyzed this plan in great detail in other places. Here you see Mrs. Wood's storeroom. That storeroom was the bottle khana. So sometimes it's called the storeroom, sometimes the bottle khana. And then we have one image, and that's a caricature by George Atkinson in Korean Rice and 40 Plates. It's called The Judge's Wife, where she is, giving out the produce for the day. And I love the oversized cat, which looks like a bit of a little small tiger. But here you have, and you can see this. These are bottles. And a shelf like this, to you, it may not look anything new because you're used to these vases. You need to go back and think of the mid-19th century, how novel this was in any house, in Indian houses. There were no horizontal shelves, even bookshelves, with a novelty in the mid-19th century, which it would be very similar to this arrangement. Okay. So here, of course, the judge's wife she's considered a very astute sort of a housewife who knows how to catch servants, cheating, etc. But she is, sitting. She's the only person sitting. She's being fanned. There are more bottles there. These are her servants. They're all male servants. So in other words, there is a certain microdynamics of power being represented here, even in humorous form. Let me move from that small scale to what the colonial authorities were trying to do with repeated Abkari regulations. And this is area of research by itself. I want you to look at this map. This is the map of the Bombay Presidency's Abkari system. If you don't know anything about this, it'll be pretty much indecipherable to you. Let me point out a few things here. Is that all of these little different patches, and they are indexed here, means that there's so many different systems at work in one presidency that it was very confounding to the authorities, because they are all different systems in terms of stillhead duties, in terms of production. And then the lovely thing is, here is this gray border, and that's supposedly the area from which all stills has been cleared, because those are the native states. Here you can see what I describe as native capital from these native states, and liquor sloshing into the Bombay Presidency, with the colonial authorities very little to do with stopping it. They couldn't stop it because this has been going on for a long time. In 1810, the country liquor shops in Gujarat and Rajputana were considered absolutely incalculable. I still haven't found a good, census of those, because they're country stills. Like every village had, at least one still, probably multiples. Okay, if it just was just village-wise, it would be not that difficult because you know the names of the villages. But there were clearly more, right? Perhaps most houses that could afford it had it. And to control those, because the reason the colonial authorities are interested is because this is a tremendous source of revenue. I mean, it's an unbelievable source of revenue, that they want that in their coffers. The over 26,000 here in 18 in Madras Presidency is probably underestimated, I would think. Okay, and in Bombay, and this is the report I was very closely looking at is Bombay, and they're also trying to regulate the imported liquor shops. Okay, and in Bombay, Thane, and so on and so forth. But they were claiming the new Abkari regulations had helped increase the Abkari revenue. But what was interesting is that the revenue from domestic liquor was 284 times more than revenue from foreign liquor. So this is something that they gave them both anxiety, because they also knew that most even if you ply them with rum as a ration in cantonments and in sailor houses, European working classes were drinking in the bazaars. Okay, so how do you control that? Because they are imagining all kinds of liaisons that they don't want happening, because this is the kind of socialization that is dangerous, and it certainly cuts across race lines. So what they did ultimately from the 1870s, and this is what they are claiming they have reaped the benefit, this is extraordinary. They came up with a distillery system, but they huddled in over 4,500 in 2 centralized distilleries with very tall walls, literally enclosed, like, as a prison would be enclosed, with little stills operating. Stills are still operated by individuals, mind you, but somebody gets to see how they go in and how they go out. What I want to, invoke here, and the rest of the few minutes I have now in the afternoon, is why use maps? Because in our previous discussions we have said, do you really need to map this? What does mapping mean? So now maps are used for multiple reasons. One, of course, the basic is to show geographical features and relations among them. But they're also used primarily, and this is for navigation and military reconnaissance, is probably the first and most important, and that's how they came into existence, and then revenue assessment, the old-fashioned cadastral surveys before you have modern cartographic methods, and to really demonstrate territorial possessions. It is useful to know that because we are so used to modern cartographic methods that were, devised from the mid-18th century onwards, that there are traditions of mapping completely different imagination of space in other cultures, and they are live and well. So this is Micronesian, they're called stick charts, and which they're made of plant materials, shells and pebbles. What they show, and if you don't know the meaning, it will be impossible for you to decipher. They actually show patterns in ocean conditions using curved palm ribs, and they use pebbles, etc., to show little islands. In Australia, no people, Aborigines can travel across vast distances using songs as maps. They're called song lines. They remember, they can memorize songs that will help them navigate across vast expanses, which for anybody who is not attuned to that would be just desert, like indecipherable. In other words, this is very important to recognize that there were valid and useful ways of navigating landscapes without the modern maps that we are used to. The historical problem of mapping is that, the modern maps, and this is the Mercator's projection and all of that, is that here is a spherical planet and you're using horizontal paper to wrap around it, and it creates, inaccuracies, and you're ultimately manipulating size. So I like this little, GIF, which shows you this is what it looks like. This is what really, this is what. Let me put it this way: the map should really be like this, okay? But it is not like this. We are not used to this kind of contours of the world, okay? We think of Africa as more squat, this as, in a different shape, and that is because of the way the adjustments were done, and this is based on Mercator's projection, is that some continents, like Africa, are actually shown smaller, which means if you are thinking about allocating resources, it makes sense that Africa should have less resources, as opposed to, let's say, North America, which is shown much bigger. Okay? So the gross inaccuracies of our modern cartography becomes very evident. This is a live, point of debate and thinking about how to understand the basic ideological problems in maps and mapping. Now, maps have been ideological tools for a long time. This is nothing new. And just going back to the early modern period, here is Queen Elizabeth standing on a map of England. And not that the map is that accurate, okay, but that doesn't matter. But she stands on a map which represents her terrain. In other words, maps become equivalent to the real terrain. The same thing with Louis XIV, whose Palace of Versailles I gave you some images of yesterday. Here are vast, like really large maps. He's represented in that. French Academy of Sciences. Here are, maps and, globes. And outside you can see a landscape space. There's a direct correlation between maps, globes, the patron, the monarch, and the landscape space. They are connected through an ideological and, epistemic lens. Maps, the fact that maps are manipulated, it was very well known. So you have a caricature of Cecil Rhodes on the map of Africa when he said he will connect the continent with telegraph lines. It's a caricature, but he would have been pleased by this, mind you, because it is fathomable. And a version of this Abhishek showed the other day, which is, George Perkins' map of the British Empire. There are different versions of this. One which has embellishments around it to make its Oriental ideology much more clear. Perkins was a Canadian and an ardent imperialist. And if you look at this, it tries to show that between the telegraph network, within the commercial network, the British Empire is one connected entity. Of course, he's not attending to the parts that are not connected, since the argument is about connectivity and the togetherness of empire. But the empire was fractured always. It is a rhetorical move to think of empire as a connected, whole, homogeneous entity. It is very rare to see maps as anything rather than finished products given to you as an end product that you have to believe in somehow. There's one depiction, and this is in Matthew Edney's very good book on mapping, colonial mapping in India, and it actually shows a surveyor knee-deep in water, and I love the fact that this is a bank, since I'm interested in river banks and so on and so forth, trying to survey. The difficulties and the impossibilities of surveying land and water and the conjunction in between is really registered. This is, of course, a caricature, but it is very telling that these are very few. You are not shown the very, the deep difficulties and, like I said, the impossibilities sometimes of mapping and how they are kind of fudged together. Abhishek, should I stop here today and then now, or should I?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. So, one of my projects, and they are all linked in one way or another, is about actually the Gangetic Plains. And I got into this project because I was transfixed, let's say, by the maps of the Gangetic Plains, or rather the maps of the rivers. And that allowed me to think about not just the relation between land and water, but how we think of the movement of water and the staticness of land, which is a fiction. Depending on what scale you're thinking, land is moving. Okay? Particles are moving. No matter, so it depends on what scale you're investigating at. But these are some of the basic questions I was asking. How has been defined, mapped, constructed, inhabited, and that not only brings into my fold in terms of research and evidence, not only the surveys, but also the embankments, the canals, and the bridges, and also, after that, the infrastructure, the irrigation infrastructure, and the hydroelectric infrastructure that were built next to it. So I wanted to understand, ultimately, the relation between land and water. One of the most fascinating maps of the Gangetic Plains is from the mid-18th century by James Rennell, sort of described as the father of British geography, sort of a little bit grudgingly by his 19th century successors. But his maps he was basically asked to map the Ganges and the tributaries and distributaries to find, and the goal is always to find a quick passage from Calcutta to upcountry without having to go through the Sundarbans, because it is very difficult, to navigate. And his was definitely reconnaissance maps. In other words, this is given as a military priority in the 1760s, just after Plassey. So this is still, Clive is still, in control. So, and he took really, he was trained as a marine surveyor. He was very young. He was in his 20s at the time. And what he was doing is that these are actually triangulation marks. So he's trying to understand how the water is flowing, but there are also sands. He's trying to, demarcate the edges of the sand. But I don't need to lecture you about it, because you should know a little bit about these water bodies to know that the line between sand and watersheds. So you have to be very particular like when you are drawing it, because in a few days it will be different. Now the lines in a map is supposed to be fixed. And when the land nor the water, they are fixed, how do you map it? It's basically an impossibility, right? But that didn't stop these people from trying. What I found very interesting about Reynolds' map, as opposed to his successors, who simply eliminated and excluded information, is that he actually populated his maps with lots of notations, but really noting down what he found at that moment, to the extent that he wrote down here, this is in the Sundarbans, tiger tracks here, knowing full well, in a few days the tiger tracks won't be there. So in other words, there is what I call attention to the immediacy, even if it is ephemeral, even if it is passing, something that you rarely see. This is part of his field notes, and this is part of it, field drawings. At the same time, and of course, these were, reworked later. But to see these notations, you recognize that he is paying to the sort of the changeable landscape between land and water. He's kind of attentive to that. William Morrison is the Morrison brothers, who was given to map the Sundarbans between 1811 and 1814. Their reports are what I call despondent. They had no idea how to get this done. They were terribly afraid. Well, there are tigers, and if they did not dare step on the banks because there are tigers, and it's difficult to think of trying to map these when in a few hours you might have a different channel. Okay, not just next season. You will have a different channel in a few hours, maybe next day. So if you're coming back, you might not find that channel. Now, what I love about this map is that it looks so finished, right? It looks very complete, right? It actually is a beautiful map. It's almost entirely inaccurate. And they were sort of scolded, let me put it this way, for not doing a good job. But what they did is, to their best of their abilities, they were, let me give it that they were not as skilled as Reynolds, perhaps, are not as smart as noting down those particular temporal parameters in the plan. In trying to produce a finished map, they basically, this area here, that's just what I call in good old architectural design language, fudged. Okay. In other words, we have no idea what's really happening here. And this bothered the colonial authorities, because they are, at this time, interested in bringing the Sundarbans under revenue administration. They know cultivation is happening. They know salt is being, produced in there. They know, crops are being produced. They want to bring that under colonial authority. So this is important to them in terms of revenue extraction. But the best piece is mid-19th century, and this is by James Ferguson, who's an indigo planter, and he has a plantation in Jeshore. And he is better known as an architectural historian, self-made architectural historian. He lived 5 years in India. And he, with another colleague, started, he took part in some surveys, and he gave a paper, and this is on recent changes in the Delta of the Ganges in 1863 in London, and he produced some maps to support his argument. So this map, what he tries to show is that all these red, and this is, you can see that this is Calcutta here, all these red ones are changed courses. Perhaps at this scale, that is all you can show, but that doesn't even closely capture all the changing courses, like not even close. Okay. But he had a wonderful description, and I want you to take a little bit of time to read this. It says, it's talking about part of the lower delta. The river is nearly where it is shown on the map, but as it was there in 1853, 52-53. It certainly is not there now. The city of Sirajganj, the largest and most important mart in that part of the country, is somewhere in the neighborhood now, but not where marked on the map, of course. And it is annually obliged to accommodate itself to the vagaries of the stream and change its locality. It may be 10 miles up the stream or 10 miles further down or 5 miles further east and west, but it is somewhere thereabout. And that is all the information the geographers can put for a country where land can only be classed with floating capital. In other words, the maps are simply don't make any sense. Okay, not he can't make a sense of that, right? At least he knows that it is a what I call mobile land. He's trying to map a mobile land. Now, unlike Rennell, who said, okay, this is what can be done, and Rennell was very much against constructing any canals, any cuts to smoothen passage. He said, you won't be successful. He was very clear about that. In the 19th century, there was a prevailing political attitude is that yes, you will make those canals and you will pretend to be, if you are not, successful. So all the things about embankments, canals, etc., what happens later is based on a presumption that these maps, etc., is giving you there's some truth value to these, based on which you are doing those canal construction, bridge construction, embankment, and so on. So Ferguson did something very interesting. He just leaped to a mode of generalization. He didn't want to kind of deal with the nitty-gritty of the Gangetic Plains. He started thinking about all the ways in which these are generic patterns, of which rivers meet, tributaries meet the water and then meet the river, and then how they, drain into a sea or an ocean. And he's thinking about different patterns of basically different networks of rivers. Because only at a general level he could make sense of it, but not at the sort of the level, at the ground level, at the nitty-gritty level. And it is useful to think here is that if the infrastructure of the Gangetic Plains, and I'm just concerned for the moment with the lower Gangetic Plains, was so difficult to map, that means it's very difficult to construct the infrastructure. What happens if we shift vantage and think of the water and river from a different point? And this is a literary evocation of a flood coming into the village. This is a description of a small, very, very remote village in present-day Bangladesh. And this is by acclaimed writer, painter, dancer Rani Chandu. And it's Amar Bape Bari means my mother's father's house. So it's a very evocative, beautifully written book. But what I was taken by how she describes that she's remembering herself as a child. It is written in 1977, but she's remembering days in like 1915, 16. People run along with the water. Flood is an expected occurrence. It's not a catastrophe. It is an expected occurrence. And you run with the water. There's an expectation of what will fill up when, and then all of these, and she of course uses the local Bengali terms, and then the water comes, it overflows, and then it comes into the house, in the courtyard. It rises, ankle deep, knee deep, and then it stops. And it stops just short of the veranda, because they were very high, expecting that the water will rise. So they were expected to be above water level. So water would stay there for 3 months, not deemed a problem. For us, it would be a catastrophe. Because, these are, primarily, mud buildings. This is actually a quite well-off family. This is not, this is not a impoverished family. This is think of middle class is perhaps not the right term, but people who had could afford a good kind of building. But building with anything but mud in a situation like that is folly, because you will be what would happen is what happened to James Ferguson. He built a house of bricks and was under the waters in no time because the river just took it. Okay, river just swept by and took it down. So building in with earth is the sensible solution in places like that. So for 3 months it would stay, and she has a very evocative description of how life occurred, happened around that, and nothing stopped. In fact, because the road infrastructure in that part of the Bengal was so bad, that now that you have sheets of water, now boats could go everywhere into, and they could dock in the tower of the house. And this was really good, because now you actually had proper movement. Mobility was finally realized as it should be, because the road infrastructure didn't allow it. And that's something to think about, when we think about, the necessity of roads, for example. We always think, if there's no road network, how do you even, imagine spaces? It is useful to consider what it would mean, what are the alternatives. And this is very recent history. It's not, like a remote past that we cannot reach back to. I'll end there before I pick up on this strand later.